Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Canto Conversations. My name is Teresa Wankin, and I'm your moderator this morning as we speak about unique pandemic lessons to better prepare you for multi-hazards. The last 18 months have taught us that when it comes to multi-hazard, there's no templates available. This morning, we have a wonderful lineup of experts who will give us insights into unique pandemic lessons and best practices that can guide us when dealing with multi-hazards. Our guest, Ms. Heather Wallen-Byron, Senior Manager, Business Continuity Management for Flow Jamaica, and also the Chair of Canto's DRM Committee. Ms. Karen Piper is the Manager of Communications and Disaster Management at CARILEC, and Ms. Elizabeth Riley is the Executive Director of CDAP, charged with the Regional Response Mechanism for Caribbean and is responsible for coordinating all the national units. Just to go over some housekeeping rules before I welcome these fine young ladies, remember to mute your microphones and post your questions for the speakers in the group chat. Kindly remember to note your names when posting, so if we can identify you if you have questions or if we have follow-up questions and actions after the webinar. Ladies, welcome to Canto Conversations. First up, I'm going to invite Heather to share her presentation and give us an overview of Canto's Disaster Preparedness Committee and her work in Cable and Wireless, Flow to be exact, Jamaica, in dealing with pandemics, especially dealing with multi-hazards. Heather?
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. So, Flow Jamaica is actually, as a matter of fact, we're in high preparedness now for the hurricane season. And this year, you know, as we did last year, we are into multi-hazard preparations. The Canto DRM team has been a very active team. We have worked right through the pandemic. We have developed some excellent guidelines, which our members are privy to. If you just contact our DRM teams. One of the things that we have found out though with disasters in particular is that persons are not interested in response unless it's hitting them directly. So we need to be better prepared. The Canto DRM team has had simulations in the past. Last year, we actually did one, right, with CARILEC, which is our electricity umbrella grouping in the Caribbean, which came out excellently. And we're urging you to be prepared. We're right now in the middle of the season, starting the season. Our peak period is actually in September for the Caribbean, August to September. And we are seeing an increase in the number of hurricanes and their intensities. So with that said, if you want to join the Canto DRM team, new insights, new knowledge every year, you can always send Teresa an email and we'll be willing to accommodate you. So I'm going to be starting now with my presentation. Thanks for that, Teresa. So we're actually looking at unique pandemic lessons throughout the season. So throughout multi-hazards, my focus will be on the background of our Caribbean states, or vulnerabilities, the lessons learned, and some opportunities that we can make use of. So our background in the Caribbean, recently we've had 114 earthquakes recorded in January 2020 throughout the Caribbean. 2020 was actually a record-breaking year for hurricanes. We've had the intensities have increased, the number of hurricanes have increased. The systems actually started from May. We've had the Soufriere volcano started erupting on May 9th, 2020. And because of climatic changes, we have had multiple floods due to severe weather conditions. So all of this we've had to be managing throughout a pandemic. Our Caribbean islands are very vulnerable to tourism. It's our mainstay because of our climate. And because of this too, we are more exposed to other conditions that result from our sea surrounding areas. We have dense populations and most of our businesses are along our shorelines. That makes them very vulnerable. So the results, what has happened since the pandemic? What has happened? What is happening now in multi-hazard response? Our DRM responses now require a multi-hazard approach. So gone are the days when we can just say, oh, we're focusing just on hurricanes. So throughout our responses to flooding and tsunamis, earthquakes and hurricanes, we've had to observe COVID-19 protocols. And previous multi-hazards were focused on like hurricanes, hurricanes come with flooding. Now we are seeing that the Caribbean has so many multi-hazards. We're now focusing on, like in St. Vincent, tsunamis, the possibility of floods and hurricanes while we're in a pandemic. So what did we learn? These are some lessons that we've learned over the period. That we now require to have sound disaster risk governance. We need plans and simulations. So our risk assessments have to be on point. We need to identify what are our known risks. No longer should hurricane be, okay, this is a disaster that we're all preparing for. We now have to look outside the box. We have to start looking at flooding, the possibility of an earthquake happening while we're in the middle of a hurricane season. We have learned too that emerging technologies assist greatly in managing disasters. So for example, early warning systems, like in the case of St. Vincent, they were able to respond to the volcano because of the early warning systems by the UE seismic research there. Also, we need early warning systems for detection. Social media is an emerging technology that has helped in a positive way and a negative way in the sense that information gets around very fast. So these are emerging technologies that we now need to be using. Our virtual space is also of importance in the sense that our people are now working from home. Gone are the days when we think that we have to be in a physical space in order to manage. So we now have to emerging technologies, the new technologies into our disaster management space. We've also learned that mental health considerations need to be managed. Before now, there was also the need and the thought that mental health, apart from humanitarian supplies, was one of the critical things that you respond to right after a disaster. But it came on more so during the pandemic. So our own disaster planning should have mental health considerations and management within them. We also learned that because of legal requirements for health, safety, and environment in a lot of our businesses, persons were not able to be as agile and were able to respond as quickly as possible to the pandemic that required certain PPE, personal protective equipment gears in use. So what we're finding now is that because of this, because there's not much legislation throughout the Caribbean, in some islands there are, but in a majority of the islands, there are no health and safety regulations for persons on the job. It made the turnaround or the pivoting a little more difficult for them. The other lesson that we learned was that we need to collaborate more and we need to share information. And this was one of the main ways in which best practices were actually being transferred from one business to the other, from one island to the other. The pandemic was unprecedented. We had no idea as to what exactly to expect and what to do. But because of information sharing, we were able to do that. On the other hand, while a lot of our plans look at our supply chain we now need to more focus on supply chain disruption for disasters. And then because of the virtual world that we now exist in, a communications plan is key in managing any kind of disaster, because this will help with reducing any kind of panic by persons when faced with a disaster. So what are the opportunities? The opportunities that we know are faced with and that we can make use of is, one, to include mental health management in our disaster preparedness. We have to begin to look at 4 separation challenges. The fact that persons do not have the social network that they are used to, the fact that persons are now required, if they are tested positive, to be isolated, the mental health issues that comes with that. So we have to now begin to look at our disaster risk management planning to incorporate mental health management. We also need to incorporate contagious disease management in existing DRM planning. So while we're faced with a pandemic that is impacting the world and we're getting best practices, before the pandemic came, we had SARS and we had all different types of flus that people were exposed to. We now have to begin to consider that when persons are responding to any kind of disaster, that they may be exposed to any kind of contagious disease. And we need to be aware of that, document that, simulate that, and ensure that our people are protected. The other opportunity that is presented for us, even in the absence of any kind of legislation on health, safety, and environment, is that we should ensure that we have an health, safety, and environmental management system in our companies in order for us to recover better. And by this I mean is that we need to have like space allocation requirements. So for example, in Jamaica in the pandemic, the first workplace spread was in the call centers. And it was primarily due to the close proximity of persons in the call centers. Our HSE management system should also look at mandatory PPE usage. It should be a normal thing. So risk and hazards should be identified in the workplace, and then the necessary PPEs are given to persons to wear routinely to protect them. The other opportunity that we have is that our responses to the pandemic was that one size fits all. If you are isolated, it meant that you should be by yourself in a room with your own bathroom and so on. Our diverse social economic conditions in the Caribbean does not allow this to happen. So one size does not fit all. So just as we have different responses for coastline persons during the hurricane, we need to have different responses for social economic groupings across the Caribbean. And then we need to be utilizing more our emerging technologies, our warning systems, detection, and communication. Like in Jamaica, or Flow Jamaica in particular, has signed an agreement with ODPEM, or National Disaster Risk Management Agency, to provide emergency communication messages to all our customers on our database. So the information will reach them quicker, because what is happening now, gone are the days when people would be listening to the radio, so much so to get a disaster alert. Persons are more in tune now with social media. So we need to begin to make the use of the emerging technologies more so that we get to persons to have them responding promptly to mitigate any impact of a disaster. And finally, thanks for your attention. So those are my opportunities coming out of the lessons learned. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Heather. And remember to post your questions for Heather in the group chat. And Heather, I want to say thank you for your presentation, especially the opportunities. It is certainly an opportunity for the region and all the telcos, all the stakeholders, CDAP, CARILEC, to come together to work on the common good coming out of this pandemic. So the pandemic has certainly opened our eyes to the several variations of disasters that we had. you'd remember that just before the volcano in St. Vincent in the DRM committee meeting, we talked about what will happen if we had floods during the pandemic. And a couple of weeks after, we had a volcano. So in addition to dealing with the pandemic, the volcano came. So thanks so much for that. And we'll get an opportunity to discuss some more avenues for collaboration and how best practices later on in the webinar. Now, before I introduce Karen to share her slide, I'm really excited that my good friend, Mr. Cletus Burton, has graced us with his presence, and he will say a few words before Karen starts her presentation. Cletus?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Teresa. Good morning and a pleasure to be here. Apologies, I can't be on video for the moment, but simply just to express CARILEC's pleasure and delight in being part of this forum. The multi-hazard environment indeed calls for multi-agency response. And so we're extremely pleased to be collaborating with Canto in this conversation, as well as CDEMA, our trusted partner, also CARTHA and the CARICOM Secretariat we routinely have collaboration with. And I'm just delighted that we're here this morning and to hand over to Karen, who is our most capable disaster coordinator and communications manager, and to say that we trust that the information and knowledge shared will increase the level of effectiveness and efficiency of our individual and collective responses to this multi-hazard environment. So thank you, everyone, and do have a pleasant sit-in. Over to you, Karen.
Thank you, Cletus.
Thank you so much, Dr. Burton, and thank you very much to Canto for the invitation to present at this webinar this morning. So I will just go ahead and share my screen. Just let me know that everyone can see it. Okay.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So this morning, I have the pleasure to present on the topic Unique Pandemic Lessons to Better Prepare for Multi-Hazards. So my presentation will be delivered in 3 parts. We'll just go through a brief overview of CARILEC and the CARILEC Disaster Assistance Program, CDAP, and also current CDAP initiatives that we've been working on within the past year, so from 2020 to present, and also previous CDAP deployments that has happened within the last 4 to 5 years. And finally, a wrap up with lessons learned to better prepare for multi-hazards, of course, which is the essence of our conversation here today. So CARILEC, as we know, is basically the regional institution for energy solutions providers, and our membership spans within the Caribbean region, Central and South Americas, and globally, we also have some members in North America. So basically, the CARILEC function aims to improve communication among its members, provide technical training and information, capacity building, conferences, and other services. And as I go through my presentation, you will notice that a lot of the CDAP initiatives that have been undertaken within the past few years and before around those core functions and values. So what are those values? Just to run through briefly, collaboration. So we aim to foster teamwork throughout the region, of course, with our regional partners as well, like being here on this conversation with Canto, CDEMA, CARICOM, and other partners. Also, innovation. We want to be the catalyst for change in the region and create multiple opportunities for our members and stakeholders. Also, high ethical and professional standards, maintaining the highest quality of service in delivery to our members, and our social and environmental responsibility. Of course, that will be our platform for renewable and sustainable energy development in the Caribbean. So definitely ensuring that our processes are taking care of our environment. So just very briefly, CARILEC currently has 111 members and consisting of 33 utilities, 60 associate members, 8 independent power providers, and 10 affiliate members. I just want to point out here that our CDAP membership consists of 28 participating utilities, which is 85% of our membership, which is a considerable amount. So most of the CARILEC utility membership, they are also part of CDAP. So of course, let's move into really the meat of the matter, the CARILEC Disaster Assistance Program. So this was established in 1998 as a regional response mechanism for disaster assistance. Over the years, the CDAP program has delivered restoration assistance to on more than 20 separate occasions. But as I mentioned, I will just highlight some of those restoration services provided within the last 4 years. So before I go on to that, just a view of how CDAP operates. So the fund is managed by the CARILEC Secretariat, of course, and it operates through the members pooling together into a mutual fund, which will be used in the event that a member requests assistance. But their roles and responsibilities are shared between the Secretariat and the CDAP utilities. So of course, the Secretariat would do the updating of the CARILEC Disaster Response and Restoration Manual. We would also provide humanitarian assistance in cases where affected states have requested assistance, and liaising with various regional organizations to collaborate and to manage the restoration given in the event of a disaster. So the utility responsibilities would be to ensure that they have a comprehensive disaster management plan, ensure that their crews are well prepared ahead of the hurricane season. So in the event that we need to deploy, we know exactly how many linesmen we have and how many workers and engineers we have at as our resources in order to deploy. So they would need to also indicate their requirements. So if there is a disaster, for instance, a hurricane, of course, we're talking about a multi-hazard context. If there is a volcanic eruption, we would need that information on hand to know what exactly is required in terms of deployment so that we can then communicate this to the utilities who are able to assist. Also, they would need to take care of the in-country logistics. So for instance, the accommodation. Of course, with COVID-19 being on the forefront these days, how would that work out in terms of the protocols, in terms of the country's own requirements for incoming crews? So all of these details would have to be finalized way ahead of the hurricane season, especially, but in our current context, throughout the year, as you can appreciate, so that that information is always pertinent and updated. So just to speak on some previous CDAP deployments. So in 2017, CDAP was deployed to Anguilla, the British Virgin Islands. In 2017, we know we had a very busy year with the hurricanes. We also deployed to Dominica. And also in 2019, after Hurricane Dorian, Abaco in the Bahamas, CDAP teams were deployed there. And also, we also deployed our Energy Solutions Advisor, Mr. Thomas Mitchkate, along with the CDAP Detailed Damage Assessment Team. This was very recent, just in April. So just to speak a little more about that deployment. So Mr. Thomas Mitchkate was deployed on April 14th as part of the DDAP team, as I mentioned. And this team also comprised of officers from CDMA, CARPA, PAHO, and UNICEF, just to name a few. And his responsibility with that team was to conduct the assessment for the St. Vincent Electricity Services Limited to determine how much damage was done to the electricity sector, and of course, recommendations for restoration. So that report would consist of sector and damage assessment, provision of cost and risk scenarios for ongoing eruptions. Of course, we know again in the multi-hazard context, and recommendations for long-term measures for sector resilience. So in this case with St. Vincent, we see that the CDAP deployment took a different forum. So it wasn't the traditional having to send over the line workers to restore power, to restore damaged lines. So I will come to that just a little bit later, but it just shows how the nature of disaster restoration and deployment is becoming a lot more diverse. And of course, we have to adapt and be flexible because it's no longer a situation of the regular deployment is just going over to assist an island in power restoration after a disaster or after a hurricane. Just to mention briefly that CDAP has recorded a very good response from the utility members. I must make mention of this whenever we call on them for assistance to assist sister utilities in the Caribbean. So I mentioned the previous CDAP deployments, but on Willow, we had 11 utilities responding. For BVI, we had 3 utilities. For Dominica, we had 9 utilities responding. And also for the Bahamas, Abaco, we had 6 utilities responding. So just to highlight here that you can see the collaboration and the teamwork speaks volumes for our region in terms of coming to the rescue when there's a disaster. So just to run through some CDAP initiatives, again, we will see how this all ties together when I just review the lessons learned. So though we have not had to deploy within the past year, of course, with COVID being a challenge to navigate, and everybody was trying to find out how do we do this in the context of the restrictions to airline and travel and quarantine and all of this. But we have strived to remain very active and to continue to provide that value to our CDAP members. So we have been delivering very comprehensive information notes on any weather systems that may affect CDAP participants. So these include weather updates, storm tracking, and also restoration progress. And we also try as much as possible to include whatever initiatives are going on with our regional partners, such as CDIMA, such as Kanto, Kawasa, what they are doing in any restoration efforts as well, so that these reports can present a very holistic view to our members. So in addition to that, we have held several forums and key meetings over the past year to prepare, of course, for responding in a multi-hazard context. So this includes, as Heather mentioned in her presentation, a multi-hazard simulation performed June last year, along with CDIMA and Kanto, the regional deployment protocols webinar where we introduced the CDAP deployment protocols, and also our disaster and risk management symposium held with several of our regional partners, CAFA, Kawasa, Kanto, CDIMA. And most recently, we conducted our 2021 Virtual Disaster Coordinators Roundtable. So I just want to mention here that, again, you can see us having to diversify and having to make modifications to the way CDAP has been operated. Of course, most of our events before would have been held in person, but now these meetings are being held virtually, but nonetheless, just as effective. So these are just the reports that we generate coming out of those discussions. We ensure to capture all of the information shared, again, going back to CARILEC's values of information sharing, technical expertise. So we ensure that that information is captured and delivered to our members and partners so that they can make the necessary implementations, be it in their DRM planning, in the updating of their disaster manuals. So just to speak briefly on the 2021 update of the CDAP manual, and also ensure that our information is very updated, and this is very important for disaster management. And I also say for a key lesson learned, one of the things that tends to happen is you collect information on restoration, on the disaster coordinators and the contacts of the local NEMOs. But you know, things happen, people move on to other positions, people are no longer in the position, and in the event of a disaster, you may have a contact for someone but realize this person is no longer there. So we try as much as possible to update that information and to provide our members with those updates so that when a disaster strikes, we're not scrambling to find out who is our direct contact person. Of course, we work hand in hand with the NEMOs, the affected states, for disaster restoration and deployment. Also, the need to communicate in a very timely and effective manner. So that's why we thought it necessary to initiate a CDAP WhatsApp group. And this WhatsApp group consists of currently 36 participants representing all of our CDAP countries, so that we can present the information to them right away as soon as it's available for very efficient decision making. Also to touch on the CDAP webpage, which is an initiative that's currently in progress. So what we recognize is the need for information to be available in a very accessible manner. So we are putting together a CDAP webpage on the CARILEC website, which will be a channel to access all of the information that I have spoken about. So the weather advisories, the information reports, the reports from all of our meetings and forums with our regional partners, of course, would only be available to CDAP members. So they would have their particular login details, of course, and any information that is relevant to disaster restoration. So the data that we've collected in the past, which can be reviewed and used to make better decisions in the future concerning disaster and multi-hazard management. So just to keep going here, just an overview of also our drafting of CDAP deployment protocols. As I mentioned, I'll not go into that into too much detail, but we worked hand in hand with CARILEC, who has endorsed the document to include as part of our disaster manual, so that in the event that we do need to deploy during COVID, we have those protocols as our guide to ensure that the process is as seamless as possible. We also embarked last year with CANTO and CDAP on the review of the DRM document and planning. And we are also looking at the current initiative of supplementing our manpower for the CDAP and the lines workers as it relates to restoration. So again, this is a key lesson, I would say, learned through the pandemic, is that because our restoration efforts have sort of diminished because of the restriction in movement and persons not being able to travel as freely, we thought it necessary to train line workers in a lot of the CDAP participating states, so that in the event crew workers from other islands are not able to deploy, there is a reserve corps in that island that can start the restoration work right away, so that there are not too many delays with deployment. So this is ongoing. The training has sort of been delayed.
Say that again, Nisha. Yeah, I'm about to present that webinar.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Karen.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Again, you're breaking up.
Yes. So to ensure that our crews would be augmented in the event that persons cannot travel, there would be a crew in that particular affected state that can start the restoration work right away. I'm not able to, oh, there we go. So just again, working with our different partners, CANTO, the Clinton Group Initiative, we received a lot of information from them concerning the deployments following the volcanic eruption in St. Vincent. Our CDAP bulletin, which was launched last September, basically, and it highlighted how Bell was able to restore power after Hurricane Matthew, which struck them last September. And again, you see in that interview, a lot of how the disaster restoration has changed and how the utilities were able to effectively manage without CDAP deployment in that instance. So to just wrap up my presentation here, what were the key lessons learned based on all of those initiatives within the past year? So for one, timely communication followed, accompanied by follow-up action. So we've seen the need to communicate in a very timely and effective manner to ensure that our members receive the key information that they need and they're able to act right away. Mobilization of relevant stakeholders and partners. This has been very important because, again, with the restrictions due to COVID, it is important that we're able to mobilize crews, as I mentioned, through the Line Worker Reserve Corps that we're in the process of building, and also with our partners to see ways that we can possibly offer assistance remotely. This is also something that we're looking at. How can we provide technical assistance that probably would not require physical presence? Again, the cohesiveness of the organization's departments and functions. Again, we can see through my role, the merger of communications and disaster management, which is a very, very integral part of the disaster management, just to ensure that there is much cohesiveness in terms of the CDAP functions being executed. Robust and updated disaster risk management plans, very important for the utilities, again, to protect against multi-hazard disasters, again, in a multi-hazard environment that we're in. Of course, plans need to focus on the pandemic, volcanoes, hurricanes, all sorts of disasters and possible scenarios. Review of DRM plans during and after disaster, very important to make those updates as you go along. And of course, online training in disaster risk management, incident command system training, and geographic information systems training. This has proven to be very beneficial to the utilities, the use of GIS to locate almost instantly when there are power outages, and of course to restore the power in a very timely manner, and the incident command training, of course, to mobilize all resources within the organization to respond to the disaster. So these are the lessons that we've learned in a nutshell, basically, and we hope that in taking these into account, we can then work even more efficiently and deliver restoration in an even better manner going forward, of course, taking into account the multi-hazard context. So thank you very much for putting up with me during this presentation, and thank you, Council, for this opportunity.
Thank you, Karen. And we weren't putting up with you. We were getting very, very good pertinent information. And I'm pleased to announce that Canto and CARILEC has a memorandum of understanding to collaborate, because connectivity cannot reach anywhere or anyone without power. So that relationship is instrumental. But our next speaker is the person who leads CDAMA right now. And we all know that we look to CDAMA for all our collaboration efforts, for all our best practices and guidelines. CDAMA, as Karen said, and as Heather mentioned, have been running for Canto and all our stakeholders, CARILEC and all our stakeholders, simulations exercise every year. And I invite you, if you have not been participating in one of them, you should get in touch with us and know how to participate in it, because they are doing an excellent job in preparing us for the event of a disaster. So without much ado, Elizabeth, I now invite you to share your slide.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and allow me to express my thanks to Canto for inviting us to be a part of today's seminar. So in looking at this whole issue of the unique lessons from the COVID pandemic, I'm going to give it a regional perspective. And in the presentation, I will treat a little bit the matter of CDEMA, to introduce CDEMA to those of you who may not be as familiar, to talk a little bit about this multi-hazard context, because I think we probably have to disaggregate exactly what that means. And then from a regional perspective, some of the lessons that we think are emerging and we still have a way to go. And then of course, some considerations going forward. So CDEMA is an institution of the Caribbean community. And you can see on the right-hand side of the diagram, we have a large geographical remit. And what that really means is that we deal with a whole diversity of hazards, but we also deal with countries which have very diverse capabilities. And on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see the 5 areas that we have been charged to the agreement established in CDEMA. And we're probably best known for mobilizing and coordinating disaster relief to reduce the consequences of disasters. We have an information clearinghouse function, both during emergency and non-emergency times. We support our countries through arrangements, cooperative arrangements and mechanisms. And this is really about how we build the partnerships for delivering our resilience. And finally, we work with our states in terms of maintaining adequate levels of disaster response capability, principally through our regional training center. We do have an overarching strategy, which the ultimate goal is talking about resilience building, and I'll come back to that later on in the presentation. And it's delivered through multiple avenues, including strengthening of institutions, better use of evidence and facts for decision-making, and that's under the knowledge management umbrella. We look at resilience at the sector level and also at the community level as well. So let's talk a little bit about this multi-hazard context and what it actually means. So the slides show a whole diversity of the hazards that we experience in the region. And in fact, there are additional ones that could be there as well. But when we talk about a multi-hazard context, what we're really speaking about is more than one hazard taking place within a particular geographical space. And there are different dimensions to that, because of course you can have hazards happening individually. So you can get the start of one event, let's say you have a flood event, that ends, and then you subsequently could have, let's say, ashfall, and they happen separately. You could have it that the events are sequenced, so they're flowing one into the other. It could be that one of those events has an impact which exacerbates the impact of the following event. And a good example of this could be Tropical Storm Erica, where we had drought conditions which pertained for a long time. And it was then followed by an intense rainfall event. And because of the drought conditions, we saw that the excess rainfall exacerbated the landslides that happened in Dominica in the aftermath. So you can also get chain reactions in terms of events. And a good example of this would have been the earthquake in Japan, where you had the earthquake, which triggered a tsunami. The tsunami triggered an event with respect to the nuclear power stations in that area. So when we talk multi-hazard, there are a lot of dimensions, and I just wanted to make sure to put that on the table so that we understand that there's no common agreement in terms of when we say multi-hazards, what it actually plays out to be, and there can be several scenarios for that. Okay, so we talked about the other hazards. We had those on screen, but just to highlight for this year's hurricane season, we have an anticipated above average season with 18 named storms, 8 becoming hurricanes and 4 being major hurricanes. And this is out of the Colorado State University forecast, which came out June 3. In addition, we know we have the ongoing pandemic. We've had our first case in the Caribbean region, well, in CARICOM states, I should specify, in early March of 2020. So this has been ongoing for about 15 months or so now. These are the latest statistics from CARFA in terms of the impact within their CARFA member states, and there are 24 CARFA member states. So it's a little bit additional to CARICOM. And you can see these statistics on screen in terms of almost 200,000 positive cases as of June 7th, and just about 3,600 or so deaths. Interestingly, also is the vaccination numbers, because we know, of course, that there have been diverse experiences in our region with respect to not only vaccine access, but also experiences with respect to vaccine hesitancy as well. And all of this is coming into the whole conversation about what's playing out with this event. So just to summarize the kind of context that we were talking about when we went into COVID-19, we had a situation where there were very varied levels of planning and readiness for pandemic. Some countries had put in place arrangements for H1N1, the flu, which at the time a few years ago was prevalent, and we were able to build on those experiences and plans to better ready ourselves for the pandemic. And this was a good thing, but in reality, we didn't have very robust arrangements. I can indicate to you, certainly not at the regional level for pandemic. And in fact, ironically, we just concluded a conversation with CARFA planning a regional exercise where we wanted to test the pandemic plan that we had been working on with them. And that was actually scheduled for July of 2020. And we just had conversations in late 2019 and early 2020 on this matter, and then COVID happened. So as it were, we were able to develop the plan and test it in real time. So we knew that ARFA was a public health hazard with an all of society impact, which meant we needed to have an all of government and society response. There was a lot of uncertainty because we didn't know a lot about COVID-19. We were really learning day by day. And what was really clear is that there was a very varied level of risk perception with respect to risk perception on COVID-19. And so there were different things coming out on social media. COVID-19, it's a hoax, it's nothing to worry about. We had situations where persons felt, oh, well, COVID-19 is happening, but it's not going to touch us, it's not going to affect me. So there was a significant communications campaign ongoing to really inform persons about what COVID could potentially bring. And that information was changing daily. So this is the situation that was playing out. So from a regional perspective, some of the unique lessons I think that came forward were really about the importance of the regional solidarity and leadership. And I think this is one of the very positive stories that will come out of the Caribbean in the aftermath of COVID-19 when we do see the back of COVID-19, because the Caribbean region really banded together, and this is from the highest political level, and most of the persons in the region would be aware that a lot of conversations went on at that highest political level about how we could work collaboratively as a region to treat with this whole issue of the COVID pandemic. And many things were rolled out with the support principally of CARFA, which is the lead regional agency on health, the Caribbean Public Health Agency, and a series of protocols were developed, CDAP supported by looking at areas of logistics, which I'll talk about a little bit later. CARICOM impacts, provided guidance on border security. So there was a lot of work that happened behind the scenes in really having a regional approach. And I think this was incredibly positive. The other thing that I thought we learned was related to governance arrangements. And I've put a slide on the regional governance arrangements, but I do think there's going to be a space for us to talk in the aftermath of the event about the national level governance arrangements as well. So on the regional side, we recognized very early that the existing structures that we had within our regional response mechanism, and particularly our regional coordination center, needed to be enhanced if we were going to adequately be able to treat COVID, because our setup was really contemplating hazards which were of a shorter duration. So it worked well for floods, it worked well for hurricanes, it worked pretty well for earthquakes, but we'd never had the experience before of a pandemic. And as I mentioned, we were in the process of developing that plan when COVID hit. So we worked on this really quickly because we needed to have an arrangement where we could bridge the conversations between the coordination and response piece of the region under the regional response mechanism and the health components. And we worked on this with the setup of this orange cell in orange here, which is the COVID-19 core coordination cell on health. And we have kept this as a working body throughout the pandemic. It started working in about February of last year. It comprises, and I'll show you the institutions on the next slide, but you can see here on this section of the diagram, this is our regional coordination center. In white, starting here are the traditional cells, operations, information management, logistics, et cetera, around down to here, where we integrate our militaries, military regional as well as extra-regional military who support us. But we didn't have a specific space for making this connection with the health grouping. So in setting this up, what it allowed us to do is to have a formalized conduit where we could be receiving information coming out of the health sector conversations. And this is the COSHA, this is the Ministers of Health, this is the Regional Coordination Mechanism for Health Security, which is a grouping which is convened by CARFA. And CARFA also has an expert advisory group. So we had a mechanism for harnessing all of the knowledge and learning that was happening on COVID-19 and advice coming out of the health sector being channeled into this coordination group here, and therefore informing the other actions at the regional level. And over on this side, you can see we then had the political connections in terms of being able to then feed back to heads of government, have the conversations with our development partners as well. So this governance arrangement and putting it in place early, very important lesson. At the national level, I'll just speak to that really quickly. What we saw is that there were different models playing out on how COVID-19 was being led. In some countries, we saw the national emergency management architecture being engaged immediately, which of course is the ideal way to go. You do want to use your existing structures, and where the health ministries, of course, were providing then the technical guidance to the national level structure. In other countries, other types of models played out. And I think that in the aftermath of this, we do need to talk about that and the level of the kind of results we saw depending on the types of models. So the other lesson is about partnerships. And this is linked to the previous slide. So some of these institutions, the Caribbean Community Secretariat, OECS, University of the West Indies, which provided us with consistent numbers, and you'll see a slide coming forward on that in a moment. CDAP was there because we can draw upon the other aspects of the regional response to assist with COVID-19 as required. CARFA, of course, providing the guidance, and PAHO. These are the institutions, those 6 institutions are the ones which comprise the core coordination specialized cell. And we met basically weekly for most of last year. We've now shifted to every 2 weeks, and we still keep a tab on things, how things are progressing, vaccines, etc. But you can see the kind of dialogue that can happen when you have this grouping together, because you're connecting the technical with the political, and as well as with the research and information arm. And that was really necessary in helping us. I also have on screen, you see impacts and the RSS. They're part of the security cluster, and we met periodically from the security perspective on these issues as well. The other lesson was about being guided by the science. And this, I can't underscore this enough, because we were learning as we were going. And this was a global experience, not just in the Caribbean or in our individual states. So I mentioned the University of the West Indies, and this is a sample of what they were providing to us on a weekly basis. So we were able to track the curve, as it were, for each of the CARICOM states. And really watching it play out in real time. We were able to pick up trends in terms of where hotspots were developing, who was on the upward movement of a peak, or who was on the downward slope in terms of the numbers coming down. And we've been doing that now for over 15 months. And, you know, CARFA has said it really nicely here in this statement, which I pulled from their website. In fact, just this morning, I was looking and I saw this and I thought this was a really useful statement where they're really urging the reliance on evidence. And I think this is a very important point that we learned going through the process. The other thing is about opportunities, and Heather in her presentation, you know, I thought that was a really great slide where you captured the opportunities, and we really agree. And we felt that there were a lot of spaces which emerged at the regional level for us to try to push the envelope a little bit on the programs that we were doing. And one of those areas with respect to logistics, which we had just really been delving into for about 1.5 years, you know, with some specialized assistance at the coordinating unit for the first time in this area. And given the supply chain distortions that we saw, and Heather alluded to these, the PPE and access to PPE and other medical devices was very challenging for the region. And so at the political level, there was a push towards getting donations for the region as a whole. And one of the conditions was that they would come into the region in that block. And of course, we had 20 CARICOM states which had to receive either donations or PPE that were procured. And so from the CDAP side, we saw it as an opportunity to really push the envelope on our logistics program and set up an integrated regional logistics mechanism, which was sanctioned by the heads of government. It was based in Barbados, where we use both the Bridgetown port and the Grantley Adams Airport for reception of items. And at both locations, we were able to receive, break down, repackage, and then redistribute with the use of, with the support, from our partners to make sure that all countries in CARICOM were able to get personal protective equipment. And this worked quite well with good support from Government of Canada on the financial side. And this just summarizes what we were able to receive and push back out to our states from the Caribbean Development Bank that was procured. And then of course, donations from World Health Organization, the Jack Ma Foundation in China, and United Arab Emirates. The other opportunity, and I again concur with Heather, was about this whole issue of digital transformation. How are we using the technology? And we really had to pivot on the regional side to look at different ways on how to deliver programming. We always had online delivery as a part of our regional training center, but we sought then to deliver other types of programs which we traditionally did face-to-face and really felt it was best to do it face-to-face, but it really challenged us to then become a lot more creative in how we were going to deliver, and ICT was a really critical part of that. So another lesson is that it is really about the people. And I saw this coming through in one of the earlier presentations as well. And the issue of the socio-economic impact of COVID-19 on the people in the Caribbean is a story I think that does have to be told going forward. And I've said it here that COVID-19 radically altered the socio-economic profile of our region, where it pushed many persons across that threshold of the marginal. And when we say the marginal, we're talking about people who are maybe living from paycheck to paycheck, which is it's very real in our region. And it pushed them into a vulnerable group and really, in some cases, below the poverty line. And what it has meant is that it's increased the demands on our social protection systems to be able to address this. And because of this scenario, you're now seeing this reality compounding the impacts of other hazards, including, for example, the volcanic emergency in St. Vincent, where there's a big social protection program that's been developed and now being implemented to deal with this exact issue. And just some statistics there from the IDB supporting the point that's being made. And I think this point on the social protection is really reinforced through the resilience framework that we had developed in 2018 in the aftermath of Irma and Maria, when the heads of government had challenged us to really articulate what resilience meant in the context of the Caribbean. And you can see the pillars here. And the first one we had identified was about the social protection for the marginal and the most vulnerable. So this is really just reinforcing it. And the other pillars are there, I won't go into the detail. So final slide. So what are these considerations as we continue during the COVID pandemic? Because as we can see, it's not ending anytime soon. Well, we know we are in a very complex multi-hazard environment. COVID-19 has just made it more complex, but we in the Caribbean, we knew about this before. We were experiencing multiple hazards previously and trying to manage those. The hazards are across different timescales, and this poses a dynamic in terms of managing them. So you have a combination of flood and earthquake and hurricanes, which may take place on a shorter time horizon, combined now with, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines case, a volcanic eruption, which Seismic Research Center has told us has not yet ended because there's still potential for more, and COVID-19, which is now running 15 months and still going. So the time scales are important in terms of how we look at the management arrangements. I think COVID-19 has also raised a lot of human rights and ethical issues. And I think we've only just skimmed the surface of this, because as we progress more and as it becomes more and more apparent that the issue of vaccines seems to be the way that we have to go up to the level of herd immunity to get the pandemic under control, not just in the region, but at a global scale. We're already seeing it coming through where employers are raising questions of mandatory vaccination. The question is that an infringement of human rights? Because vaccines are really traditionally have been a choice, and certainly have been a choice in our region. But I think this is going to come more and more to the fore. We're seeing it creeping in now to conversations about travel and various other things. And I think we should need to watch this one really carefully. Psychosocial support was already raised, so I won't treat that any further, but I want to emphasize that we are still learning about COVID-19. We're still learning about it. We know the vaccines are going to reduce transmission, etc. But what we're seeing is that persons with vaccines are still getting ill. In some instances, they're still able to transmit the virus. And we are still learning. So even as we struggle with protocols for reopening our borders, etc., we have to bear in mind that we don't have all the information as yet, and therefore adherence to the health protocols is going to be important. And finally, I just want to say that this point on flexibility and agility I think is one of the biggest lessons that we have learned. We can't be afraid to shift or make a change. If we realize that what we're trying is not working, we need to adjust. And I think that type of open-mindedness, periodic assessment of how the approaches that we have been trying are working, and being honest in our reflection about how well they're working or not working is going to be really important. So thank you so much for the opportunity to contribute, and happy to take any questions during the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was very, very informative. I want to stay with you for a minute. We have two questions that I will give each panelist an opportunity to answer, but I have a burning question right off the bat. All the presenters spoke about collaboration, and especially when you spoke about getting donation, getting equipment from other countries. One of the things in the region that we see in the Caribbean is that there is certainly strength in numbers. Each of the islands or countries in the Caribbean has just like 1.5, Jamaica being the largest. And it always makes sense to collaborate on common issues. It always makes sense to approach any of your, It always makes sense to encourage regional collaboration and trading as a bloc. So in your view, dealing with the pandemic, I know you spoke about that, getting PPP equipment and even financial assistance, right? How has it been with collaborating with all the countries of the Caribbean? And did you see any gaps that need to be worked on? How can we close those gaps? So going forward after the pandemic, we can start to see more integration in the Caribbean.
Okay, well, thanks so much for that question. And I think it's an excellent question. And I would say overall, we saw the region coming together quite well. I sat in meetings of ministers of health meetings and also heads of government meetings, and I watched them work through some of these issues, and really from a starting point of understanding that we had to come to points of consensus on some of these critical issues. One of the things that I did observe that I thought I still think that we need to address is really about the pace of the decision making, because, and this is at individual country level for the good of the whole. And so on matters where we had to reach consensus and come to positions on it in order to be able to move forward, what we saw is, and in some ways it's understandable, because at the national level you will have your own processes for how you come to agreement. But because you are ensuring that you have all the countries on board, what it means is that the pace you can move at is the pace is as quickly as the last country, which comes back to the table and say, yes, it's a go. So I think that was one of the areas. And I need to emphasize though that was not the case in every discussion either. Sometimes the turnaround was really very quick. And I was really pleased as a very committed regionalist to seeing the regional systems working in the way that they were really envisaged to work under the revised treaty. And I think that's something really, really positive from the experience.
Excellent. So good morning, Mr. Rogers. We have a question for Mr. Rogers. I'll give you an opportunity to answer first, and then I'll ask Karen and Heather to expand on it a bit. So is there information available on the fallout from the St. Vincent volcano eruption and the spread of the virus on the island, and to external persons who may have gone to help? What is the implication for the upcoming hurricane season? So if CDAP has any statistics on what happened on the ground there, as most of the other islands mobilized to help in that area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. Thanks so much for that. So really quickly on St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So yes, as you know, when the volcanic eruption transitioned to its explosive phase, because it started effusively in December, we did have fairly significant COVID numbers on the ground. And as we went through that December through to the April period in planning, and we had brought a number of regional institutions together on that matter, including CARFA. And we were in this consistent dialogue with the authorities in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, looking at particular scenarios that could play out. And of course, the reality of potentially having to a displacement of over 20,000 persons and persons coming into shelter, even with the intent to maintain the health protocols and distancing, etc., we knew that there was a potential for overcrowding. So this was all in the scenario planning going into the discussions. We did have situations of COVID-19 in the shelters, and this was publicly stated by the Honorable Prime Minister. He, he does his morning programs, if you're following. So he did speak to this, and he also spoke to it. The Chief Medical Officer was on speaking to actions that were being taken to try to arrest this, quick removal of persons from the shelter, placing persons into isolation. I think one of the things that also came in discussions from the national authorities was that vaccine testing hesitancy was a bit of a challenge as well, where persons did not necessarily want to be tested. So I think it is a challenging situation on the ground, because you can only really understand what is happening within the shelters if you are able to do the testing, and that was not always the case. Okay, going into hurricane season, let me just speak to that one quickly. So we have a situation now where we have about, I think the last statistic was about maybe 2,800 or so still in shelters. I can verify that information for you quickly before we close off. I don't want to be misquote, but we do have, I think, another 3,000 person who are still in shelter. We have a situation where for most areas of the orange zone, persons are allowed to return to their homes. And this has happened because the Seismic Research Center has advised that the alert level could be lowered from red to orange. That happened on May the 6th. And on the 20th of May, the Prime Minister gave a directive that for certain areas, persons could return to the orange zone. Now, on the West Coast, the areas around Chateau Belair and Fitzhugh, because of the kind of impact that they saw, is probably will now be classified a little bit differently. There's been a little bit of hesitation about allowing people to go back to those areas, but a lot of the cleanup has started. However, in most areas in the red zone, people are still not allowed to go back, so they're still going to be in shelter. So for the hurricane season, I think there are a couple of things to deal with there. One, that the shelter facilities that are available in country, they're largely occupied, which means that if you do move into a threat from a hurricane, that right now there's a conversation happening about how do we organize shelter for other persons, say in the yellow or green zone, who may be in vulnerable housing, but still need protection if there is a hurricane. So they're working through this. The other thing, main thing I would say, is related to the lahars. Now, the lahar is basically a mud flow that happens in the aftermath of volcanic activity because you have a large amount of ash on the ground, and we're already seeing this. We had two severe weather events, one on April 28th to 29th, the other one on June the 5th. And basically mud flows are coming down the river channels. They are bringing large boulders with them. It is quite dangerous. Maybe some of you have seen some of the videos that have come out to St. Vincent and the Grenadines on this, and this is a significant concern because this was a hazard that was not there before, but the SRC has advised us that this could go on because of the volume of ash on the ground for maybe a year, possibly up to 2 years, as that's removed with the rainfall.
Wow. Wow, that's amazing. So I just want to get Karen's and Heather perspective on dealing with your members in St. Vincent. What were the takeaways from the CARILEC perspective, and then from the industry, the telecommunications industry perspective, Heather?
Okay, thank you. From the telecommunications industry perspective, we were not impacted. Our services were still available right throughout. But we normally, from the Canto end, we normally would support the CDAP on their request. And then all our COVID-19 protocols would be followed. Going into the hurricane season, I noticed the question was asked about how you do sheltering and so on. One of the proposals, or what has been happening in Jamaica in particular, is that you have isolation rooms for those persons who are tested positive or maybe suspected. And I think Liz pointed out that this is really an evolving science and evolving response. So as we go along, the responses will change, right? And will get better. But for the hurricane season in particular, for sheltering, it would have to be having a component of isolation rooms included as well.
Okay, great. Karen, from your perspective, how was it dealing with your industry?
Thank you very much, Teresa. So from the perspective of CARILEC, coincidentally, a few days after the eruption, the explosive eruption, we had our disaster roundtable meeting. So the representative from the St. Vincent Electricity Services was present, which we were very appreciative for. And he provided a brief update on how the utility was affected from the eruption and, of course, COVID-19. So they were not impacted severely following the eruption, but considering COVID-19, the utility has experienced a few fatalities actually from COVID-19, which of course has been a damper and unfortunate situation on the workforce. Of course, you could imagine that dealing with such an occurrence could mean also not only the emotional aspect, but also having less manpower to respond to multi-hazards. Also, they did relate to us that they were in the process of updating the disaster management plan, of course, to incorporate dealing with and responding to volcanoes and volcanic eruptions. Also, our ESA Energy Solutions Advisor, who I mentioned during my presentation, was deployed to St. Vincent, did mention that there was damage to one of the utilities plants. I believe that it was either in the red or orange zone, but I don't want to be quoted. I would have to double check. So that did create some disruption in the electricity supply just after the volcanic eruption. So there was not significant damage, but of course, going into the hurricane season, this would have to be factored in as well. How does the utility manage dealing with a hurricane in the event, hopefully not that St. Vincent does get hit by a hurricane, and also dealing with the fact that the volcano is still active. So they are in the process of updating their disaster management plan to incorporate those possible circumstances, and also drafting a pandemic response plan, which would be to cater to the employees in the event that any of the employees does contract COVID-19, and in the unfortunate circumstance that an employee dies from COVID-19. So that's just the initial update that we had from our utility representative in St. Vincent. We're thankful that the sector was not hit very badly, as much as I know from initial reports, the water sector was hit very badly.
Okay, great. So we'll keep in tune to get that report and see. We hope that it doesn't escalate out of proportion as well. We have a question from Shannon that I want Heather to answer. And Heather Shannon is asking about what is being done or can be done to make infrastructure. And he's talking specifically about our telecoms lines. And I know there was some discussion on underground lines and even the sharing of lines with CARILEC. So Heather, can you give us a quick update on that? And then I want to go into Sergio's question. And I want to end with Elizabeth telling us about mass evacuation, Lisa's question. Okay, so Heather, can you give us any plans from you? I know, Karen, you can go first and see what plans as CARILEC making to have underground lines and also to share telecommunication lines where possible.
Hi, thanks.
Telecommunication poles, sorry. It's poles I meant.
So currently, this is really the basis of the MOU that we share with Canto.
Yes.
We recognize that electricity is a major component, of course, to fuel telecommunications, which has become so important in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. So these are ongoing discussions that we're having with Canto. Currently, I do not have a date as of this moment, but I just want to mention that this is the basis of our MOU, and Heather can provide probably some more information in that aspect.
Okay, great. Heather, you want to add anything, or is it still in discussions?
Okay, I'll start with the honorable lines based on the questions. This has been in discussion for some time now. I think the main reason why we have not gone underground in most instances is the cost. And so we continue to have aerial service connections throughout the Caribbean. It would be good, ideally, in the ideal world, that would be good, considering that we're in a hurricane-prone zone and high wind damages, and we have seen the impact of it in terms of the service disruption over the years. But it's a cost factor why this has not been done. In terms of MOUs, we have signed an MOU, the Canto and CARILEC, in terms of looking at some of the commonalities and then to see where we can better work together. In some islands like Jamaica, I know in particular, we have a joint pole agreement with the JPS, the public service company. So it means that we share poles. And we also have further agreements with them in terms of our MOU that relates to restoration. So our restoration priorities are considered by both companies, the telcos and the power company, so that it can minimize any kind of downtime and more efficient restoration processes. So this is one best practice in terms of collaboration, as was mentioned earlier, as one of the opportunities that we can now look at in terms of other companies, other industries that may impact telcos in particular, which Canto primarily focus on. And the DRM team has been doing that. We have been working with and pulling in all of those industries that may have an impact on any kind of service. And the pandemic has shown us that telcos is really critical and vital in keeping people connected. That's what we're doing now. So we have to continue to look at all of those players within the Caribbean, outside of the Caribbean, that can assist us with keeping our people connected always. And that's the main reason why we have signed that MOU with CARILEC, and we continue to work together, and with CDAP as well.
Yes, okay. So thanks, Heather, staying with you. You know, we must ask a question. We say COVID is the digital accelerator for the Caribbean and all over the world. So Sergio, good morning. Sergio's question deals with emerging technology and what type of innovation you're seeing out there. I think COVID has shown a lot of pockets of innovation in the region in terms of people doing their own thing in different countries, different areas and stuff. But is there any marked effort to get like CDAP, CDAP, even cable and wireless, because I know you all had a number of digital applications coming out of COVID to help governments and roll out and stuff. How are you dealing with that at the operators level?
Okay, so that's me from the operators.
Yes.
From the operators level in particular, we have allowed access in Jamaica to our National Disaster Agency to actually install emergency telecommunications equipment. So that's one major project, and this we're doing from Flow Jamaica. I have to pull that in.
Yes.
Free of cost to the government, so they can use our facilities because the self-service allows us to go into remote areas. So we've allowed them that. And we recently, I said in my presentation earlier, signed an MOU with the government to provide SMS text messages on emergency communications, because we know now that people are relying so much more on social media, on their phones for any kind of information. So that is in place. And this is something that would urge other countries, other best practices in the Caribbean to follow, And if there are other best practices being used elsewhere, then the collaboration that I mentioned as an opportunity, then that would push us in the right direction.
Okay, great. Elizabeth, I'm saving you for last. What about you, Karen? What is CARILEC's experience? Do you have a lot of apps developed directly arising out of the pandemic, or how is it with innovation because of COVID?
So in terms of innovation, as I briefly mentioned during my presentation, what we have noticed is that the utilities have been more so relying recently on the use of GIS and the incident command training, albeit because CDAP deployment, is not as readily available because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we have seen a reliance on GIS. As I mentioned, the interview with Bell when they did their restoration after Hurricane Nana last September, they attributed much of their success to the use of GIS in terms of having that exact location of power outages to be able to respond in a very quick manner. I should also mention that because of the GIS also points out to them not just power outages, but in instances where there is damage to crops and plants. So they are able to help other sectors as well in terms of their restoration and not just the electricity sector. So recognizing this, what CARILEC has done is to initiate a GIS training that will be delivered virtually. We've actually just launched this online training to our members, particularly our CDAP participants, so that other utilities can use Bell's model in terms of restoration in cases where CDAP may have some issues in deployment or may not be able to deploy as many persons as before. Also, the utilities have accredited the incident command training, which is more so on a management and middle management level. Basically, it mobilizes personnel, facilities, and equipment in terms of coordinating the disaster response so that there is more cohesiveness in the response in terms of using technologies and also human resources. So that has been accredited as well to the success of managing the restoration, of course, in the absence of or delay of CDAP. So these two technologies of what we've been seeing the utilities crediting most of their restoration towards.
Okay, great. So Elizabeth, can you tell us about innovation in CDAMA if you all are looking at any regional applications or to develop your own? Hopefully it is from the region. And I also want you to touch on Lisa's question. Lisa, we did not forget you on mass evacuation plans. And then Sydney's question on mandatory vaccination requirement for disaster responders. So you have a big one now.
Yeah, thanks so much. So before I treat the questions, I did promise to come back on the statistics with the shelters.
Oh, yes.
So as at June the 6th, we had 65 public shelters open, and this is down from the original 87, so 22 have closed. And we have 2,849 persons in shelter, and that's in the public shelters. And just bear in mind that you have maybe about 15,000, maybe a little bit over that number still in private sheltering as well. Okay, so with respect to the questions on the mass evacuation and shelter, last year we worked with CARFA and a number of our other regional agencies to prepare guidelines for shelter management as well as mass evacuation as an emergency function in COVID-19. And it speaks to the specific health protocols that have to be adhered to, makes recommendations with respect to densities, particularly on shelters, and densities for movement of persons in various forms of transport, etc. And those are available on the CARFA and CDAMA websites. With respect to the matter of the there was a question about vaccination and if it's mandatory. The answer is no. For our deployment teams, no. We encourage the identification of persons who are vaccinated in the same way that we encourage identification of persons who are not suffering from NCDs, because we know that that predisposes towards a more negative outcome from COVID-19. So these are the things that we've been guiding our states on, but not being vaccinated doesn't preclude you from supporting the regional arrangements. There was also, I think something I saw in the chat about deployments. So I'll just answer really quickly before I come to the IT question. So on the deployment side, we've had a really interesting experience. We did a lot of work last year, just trying to put together some protocols and guidance on how we handle deployments. We got some support from CARFA on this and also sent forward some guidance up to the level of the heads of government on how potentially we could set some standards for how we handle deployments. And so St. Vincent and the Grenadines give us an opportunity to test it really. So there was a conversation around what was called a working quarantine, where if you came from a particular jurisdiction and preferably one that was categorized as low risk, you would be able to come in with a negative PCR test, and the St. Vincent and the Grenadines would facilitate you being able to work in country, preferably in a bubble. And this was really important for facilitating, for example, the work of the scientists from the Seismic Research Center, because they had been going in since about December on a rotational basis. In fact, they're still rotating right now from out of Trinidad and out of Montserrat. So that was one component of it. Now, with respect to deployments, looking at the work of the deployments and what happened during the course of that event, is that we saw, because COVID is so dynamic, this is one of the things we've all highlighted, and therefore the status of a country could shift over a short space of time, which we recognize. So during that response period, we did see some of our CARICOM states shifting from medium risk to high risk, possibly even into very high risk categories. And of course, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, as every country does, will have its indications as stipulated by the Ministry of Health on what category any particular country falls into. So because our regional system is predicated on being able to access personnel from other neighboring states, what it meant, and this comes back to our point on flexibility and agility, is that we shift with it. So if as happened during that response, they made changes to their categorization of states, it meant that we then had to remove our consideration from drawing personnel from state A, which may have now been a very high risk category, and instead look to state B, which is still in the low risk category. So this is why the statistics, the science, monitoring what's happening with the COVID-19 is so important, because you can only deal with the situation based on exactly what is in front of you at the time that an event happens, okay? But we have mechanisms for getting that information. So just quickly on the technological side, thanks for that question. So for us, the applications of the geographical information systems is absolutely key as well. We have launched last year our Caribbean Risk Information System, and it has a GeoCRIS component. And in fact, you can access it on our website. And we have on board now at the coordinating unit, just for the last year or so, for the first time, a GIS specialist. And she's been working really hard to build up the data set, support our countries with pre-impact data, and to facilitate pre-impact data analysis for them as well. We did a lot of work with St. Vincent and the Grenadines on that. Integration of satellite imagery as well as radar imagery to support the processes. We have also been looking at the potential use of drones, particularly in COVID-19, because You may not be able to go into, let's say, a community that may have high COVID numbers, and this is known, so you don't want to put your responders at risk, but you can use drones to collect imagery to support damage assessment processes. This has come into the discussions as well. And one of the things that going forward that we want to have is a real-time situational awareness platform, which connects all of the CDEMA states, 19 states, with the coordinating unit. And this is a vision of what we want to put in place. We've had some initial discussions with a couple of entities about it, and we're hoping that this is something we can move forward soon. Thank you.
That's excellent, and that will certainly be a game changer for all of us. So we are out of time this morning. This was one of our longer Canto conversation. We had just planned 90 minutes for it, and we're just above that time mark. I want to give you all the opportunity before I close to give closing remarks. Heather, can you go first?
Thank you, Teresa. Closing remarks, we need to begin to prepare. We've seen how serious this pandemic is. We've seen how many lives have been lost as a result. We definitely should not wait until it's here to plan for it. We need to ensure that we have more comprehensive disaster plans in place. There are many resources around the Caribbean which we can pull on. The Canto DRM is inviting you to join anytime so we can share experiences. I noticed someone asked in particular about evacuation. We actually have a lockdown procedure in place that can actually guide you, which we've developed for COVID. So there's a lot of resources. There's no way that we should not be prepared.
Excellent. And you've heard it from the Canto DRM chair herself. Karen?
Thank you, Teresa. So in closing, I would just like to note that there were a lot of similarities actually within the three presentations. And I think the message we're really sending to our audience today is the need for our continued collaboration among regional partners in mitigating the impacts of disaster and in navigating and managing the complexities of a multi-hazard environment. So this is definitely key as we move forward. And also, as Ms. Riley mentioned, having that flexibility as it pertains to responding to COVID-19 and the further challenge that it presents to us as we just go through this hurricane season and others to come, and possibly any other disasters that we may encounter. So we at CARILEC remain committed towards working with our partners and the people of the region in navigating these complexities, and especially to our members, as the ultimate goal is to offer that humanitarian assistance and as much as possible to minimize any destruction and damage that could occur. So thank you very much, Canto, for the opportunity here. I certainly have learned a lot and left with a lot of information. And I hope that we can have another conversation soon as we move into the hurricane season.
Excellent. And Karen and Elizabeth.
Okay, thanks so much. Just three closing comments from me. One is that in the face of the hurricane season, notwithstanding the forecast, remember it takes only one. So preparedness is the word. Two is related to let's protect our people. And I think as companies, we have to prioritize the safety of our persons in not just with respect to hurricanes, but in the context of COVID-19. And you know, as small states, we cannot afford to lose our people. They're our most valuable resource. The third thing is really about partnership and the importance of the partnerships and continuing to work together. I'm so happy to see Mr. Burton online. Hello, and thanks for all the support from CARILEC. And you know, we continue to collaborate with Canto and all the other partners, and you can count on CDEMA's support through the upcoming season. So, and thanks very much for inviting me to participate.
Thank you all so much, ladies. This was such an enlightening conversation, and we will continue this conversation most likely at our upcoming conference, but we will give you more details on that soon. So I want to thank everyone this morning for joining, staying with us, and actively participating in the discussions. If you did not get your question answered, please send us an email and we'll put you directly in touch with the speakers you heard here this morning. Remember to join us on the 22nd of June at 10 a.m. when we'll introduce one of our new members to the region, Conviva. We will chat with Danielle Benacourt on revenue growth with data science and explore a case study on how you can use data science and artificial intelligence to improve your business performance. And last but not least, remember that registration is now open for annual conference and trade exhibition. Register early to secure your space for great content, premier branding, and superb networking opportunities. So as we adapt to the new normal, let's remember that we are not yet out of the pandemic. Please continue to wear your mask, watch your distance, and wash your hands. Thank you, everyone.